All right, guys, welcome back to our teaching in the book of First Thessalonians. Now, the last time we were here, we were finishing up chapter 1 in Paul's basic salutation, his greeting to the Thessalonians, and his thanksgiving for the church, and as well as Paul talking about how that the gospel that he preached that had gone to the Thessalonians, they received the gospel. And when they received the gospel, they received it with great joy and excitement. And this was evidenced in their salvation. And they themselves spread the gospel all throughout the regions of Macedonia and Achaia. So basically, that was the idea of chapter 1. And it was for the most part, salutation. Hey, how are you doing? Whatever. We thank God for you, and we see your election. That is the proof of your salvation. The proof of your calling is in how you responded to the gospel with changed lives, and how you yourselves witnessed the gospel basically in the general missionary sense, that is, not specific individuals, but simply wherever the Thessalonians would go, they would speak of their changed lives. Their changed lives would be the evidence of their salvation. Okay, so enough of that. So now we're going to get into chapter 2. But in chapter 2, what we're going to do is, it is of some length, but of course, all of it is connected with Paul speaking of his ministry among the Thessalonians. But in order to kind of congeal the thought of particular sections without being too long, let's just break it up into chapter and verses 1 through 8, and then we'll finish the rest of it 9 through chapter verse number 20 in another video. But anyway, all right, so let's begin in chapter 2 as Paul begins to talk about his ministry amongst them, and this would be the prevailing thought and idea of all of chapter 2. Paul's ministry, the purity of his ministry, the reason for why he ministered even in oppressive situations, why he did what he did, and how he set himself as an example to the Thessalonians. All right, let's begin. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But after we had already suffered and had been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid such opposition. So now let's talk about that. So now Paul is bringing them into reflection of Paul's time with them. And we see this in Acts chapter 17. But anyway, he says, you yourself know that our coming to you was not in vain. So he's speaking of how the Thessalonians received the gospel. And as he's going to talk about in verse number 2 and even further down, also with reflection, as we just said, Acts chapter 16, we're going to talk about that, and Acts chapter 17. Okay. But the point is, there was great opposition to the gospel by enemies of Paul. There were Gentile opposers of the gospel, and extremely, there were the Jewish opposers of the gospel. But nevertheless, when Paul came to the Thessalonians, they received the gospel, and he's going to talk about that later on in this particular chapter, not simply as the word from men, but indeed as it is the word of God. So they received, you yourselves know. And let me just make this side point. There's a word here, oidate, that is, you know, and it seems to be in the perfect tense, but we're not going to get into a lot of Greek grammar in this particular teaching. But nevertheless, this word occurs a number of times in this particular chapter, which gives a sense, not so much of a sub-theme, but a principal driving point that Paul is trying to make. That is, and he says this, artoiga oidate, that is, for you yourselves know. And because that, first of all, oidate, which is the verb that we translate know, but he says autoi, which basically means yourselves, and that is giving the emphatic. But the point that I'm trying to stress is, because of that occurrence, that in this chapter itself, the frequent occurrence of this particular word oidate, it lets us know that Paul is saying, you know, Thessalonians, you can remember, you can examine our conduct. And thus he is telling them to recall, Paul is telling them, recall how we were. Recall the things that we experienced. Recall the things that we did. You know these things for certain for yourself. But anyway, the point, verse number 1 and verse number 2, that when Paul came to them, they knew of the difficulties that Paul had come from, that is in Philippi, and even the difficulties that Paul had experienced in Thessalonica. Now, we find this in Acts chapter 16. Basically, when Paul was in Philippi, this is basically, and I'm not going to bring all of this in this teaching, but we recall the instance of when a demon-possessed girl who was used as a fortune teller by her Gentile master, and this was a Gentile girl, Gentile master, who was used to as a fortune teller, would follow Paul, and day after day, these men are servants of the Most High God and tell us the way of salvation. And Paul got tired of that, so he turned to the demon spirit within the girl and cast the demon spirit out. And in doing so, she lost her ability to foretell the future, and thus her masters lost their means of gain. And so they took Paul and Silas, who was also with him, brought them before the magistrates, condemned them before the magistrates, condemned them of bringing about customs and teachings and traditions that are not lawful for them to observe as Romans. And thus Paul and Silas were stripped and severely beaten and thrown into prison. And this was their experience in Philippi. So they came from Philippi into Thessalonica. So this was the oppressiveness that they experienced there, the abusiveness that they experienced. And thus, even coming into Thessalonica, while they were there, certain Jews, first of all, Paul went into the synagogue in Thessalonica as he would normally do, trying to teach that Jesus was the Messiah, proving that it was necessary, according to the scriptures, for the Messiah to suffer and die and be resurrected from the dead. The Jews as a whole rejected this message, but a number of Gentiles believed the preaching of Paul, and thus those Jews who had rejected the message began to become hostile towards Paul and hostile towards his gospel preaching. And thus we have this whole incident of them going, this is in Thessalonica, into the household of Jason and causing an uproar in the city, leading to Paul having to leave Thessalonica. So what is he talking about? You yourselves know of the difficulties that we had, how we were mistreated in Philippi, and also, as I just explained, they were mistreated in Thessalonica. And he is saying, giving reference to these things, nevertheless, in the midst of all of this harsh treatment, the gospel flourished. Our coming to you was not in vain. And notice, we had boldness to speak, boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in all of this opposition. We as Christians do not need the world to subside. We don't need the world to stop trying to oppress or come against us. We don't need an environment. Sometimes we think to ourselves, and this is what is in my mind, and this is what I'm bringing about now is practical observation that we can have from this passage. We as Christians today do not need an environment of peace to bring the gospel. Even in hostile environments, the gospel will flourish because the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. The gospel is the call of God to his elect people. So thus, it does not matter whether the environment is conducive to the preaching of gospel. And when I say conducive, I mean people are not against us and things are going well, or whether the gospel might seem to be hostile and oppressive, as we see here with Paul. The gospel will flourish because it comes from the sovereign hand of God. And oftentimes, I almost wanted to preach. But oftentimes, when we see the gospel truly flourishing, it is in the very midst of hot opposition. It is when things are at its most difficult. And by the way, let me just say this as a side note. Just go to the book of Revelation and you will see John as he is in the vision in heaven, as he is looking at the altar and see a number of souls that no man could number. And the elder asked him, who are they? From whence they came from? John says, I do not know. And the elder say, they come out of great tribulation, great opposition, a great flight of affliction, where they were dying and they were being killed in massive numbers. But notice what he said. It was a number that no man could count. Now notice that an innumerable number of people being transformed, coming to Jesus under the worst affliction the world will ever see. So again, that goes to the point that I was just making, but let me move on. Don't want to make it longer than necessary. But Paul is giving them the opportunity, in a sense, to reflect on his visit and the atmosphere that was present. Verse number 3, in the preaching of the gospel. Verse number 3, for our exhortation does not come from error, I like that, or impurity, or by way of deceit, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, powerful, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our heart. Now, Paul talks about the gospel message, but not so much as the gospel message, but the messenger himself. So what does he say? Our exhortation, the exhortation that he speaks of, is the gospel that Paul preached, a message of encouragement. This message does not come from, notice now, that gospel does not come from error. In other words, Paul was not preaching something that he did not understand. He was not preaching about Christ or Jesus as the Messiah in error. Indeed, Jesus was the Messiah. He proved himself to be the Messiah by the miraculous things that he did, and by his very presence, and by the things that he said, and ultimately by what? The resurrection from the dead. There was no error in Paul's gospel, notice, and neither from the point of impurity, that is, looking at Paul and trying to determine his motivations for why he is doing what he is doing. This is always key, because whenever we preach, whenever we teach the gospel, God will, and okay, I'm even ahead of myself here, is in the very text. God himself examines the heart. It is not, you can do something and it is the right thing to do. But God, who searches the heart, determines the motivations for why you did it. Did you do it for the right reason? Were your desires, were your personal objectives pure? In other words, did you do it for the glory of Christ? Did you do it for the glory of God? Did you do it for the well-being of God's people, to help them, to build them up? Or did you do it for some self-serving reason, from some reason of impurity, or by way of deceit, as Paul continued to talk about, impurity for gain? And we see that a lot, and Paul's going to talk about that even in this particular section. It is, why do you do what you do? Do you do it? And let me tell you something. It's just in my mind right now. It's just in my mind right now. Do you do it to put on a floor show? to stand up in front of people with a new suit on and trying to look a certain way and talk a certain way, or do you do it so that people will praise you and try to speak on how deep you are, or try to move the congregation, try to make people shout? That's what we talk about it today. Make people shout. Or do you do, or don't let me forget this part, for money, which is one of the main problems that we have in the church community today. The reason why so many preachers do what they do it for self-glory and for money. And that's the reason why most of them don't even preach the gospel. That's the reason why most of them don't talk about sin. That's the reason why most of them don't condemn homosexuality, fornication, adultery. You never hear the type of biblical preaching that we used to hear years ago. The reason why is their motives are impure. They are moved by selfish desires. Okay, enough preaching about that. Paul says that's not us. Number one, we know what we're talking about. It's not from error. Number two, it's not from impurity or by way of deceit. We're not trying to deceive the people with some feigned message. No, we're bringing the people the message of truth, the message of salvation. Then he says in verse number 4, and I like verse number 4 because it makes us think back on Paul's experiences as reflected. We talked about that earlier in Acts 16 in Philippi, Acts 17 in Thessalonica, and the hardships and the difficulties that Paul went through. Verse number 4, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. I like that. So you ask me, well, what is it that you like? You see where he says, just as we have been approved by God. And here I'm going to the Greek because it is so wonderfully important to understand that he uses the word didakimasmita. That's the word, didakimasmita. It basically comes from that word dokimazo, which means to put to the test or to be approved, to approve of. And notice what he says. We have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. So that infers something, that is, in Paul's suffering for the preaching of the gospel. Go back to what I just told you about going into Philippi, that girl following him, and all of a sudden Paul casting out that devil. Go back to Thessalonica, and the Jews harassing Paul so much that he has to be literally run out of town. All of these things are instrumental in the hands of God. God uses these things to test his servants. Will you, Paul, hold on to the task that I have given you? Will you, Paul, continue in faithfulness to me? You see, Jesus gave Paul a job. Acts chapter 9, Paul on the Damascus road, and all of a sudden, what? The Lord Jesus appeared to him, called him into apostolic ministry. Thus, Jesus says he tests Paul. And that's what I'm talking about from the Acts 16. He tests Paul as well as those other servants with him. He tests him. Will you hold on? Will you continue to preach the gospel, not only in the good times, not only in the bad times, but in the worst of times? Because when Paul was in that Philippian jail, he had been badly beaten. And not only that, he was thrown into the inner prisons and placed into stocks. But even though Paul was beaten and bruised, Paul and Silas, what did they begin to do in the midnight hour? They began to sing and to praise God. And what did they do once they were released from prison? They still went back and encouraged the brothers. And what did they do even thereafter? Chapter 17, they still continued to preach the gospel. They were proven as men who could be trusted with the gospel. God put them to the test, dokimazo, and they passed the test. And this is encouragement for us. This is encouragement for me today. What? God, even though you are called to ministry, God will put you to the test by sometimes placing opposition in front of you to see if you can be entrusted with the gospel. Look at the verse again. We have been approved by God for what? To be entrusted. God himself put us to the test to see if we can be trusted to preach this gospel no matter what. So what? In the end, he says, and thus we speak. And when we speak, remember, we are emissaries of Christ, emissaries of God. We speak not as to please men, but we speak to please God who examines our heart. And once again, that word for examine, dokimakzonte. Dokimakzonte. Pronounce it right. It comes again, dokimazo, same root verbal word. God who examines or puts to the test, proves God who puts to the test our heart. So Paul's simply saying here in verses number 3 and 4, that his preaching of the gospel is not in error. He knows what he's talking about as he preaches Christ crucified and resurrected from the dead. It's not in impurity, some form of uncleanness, impurity of the heart, impurity in motivation. Is not trying to deceive anybody, for God himself has examined Paul and put him to the test in the preaching of the gospel. Verse number 5, for we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed, God is witness, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ, we might have asserted our authority. So now he continues on in this particular part here, talks more so about the purity of heart, the motivation by which Paul did his preaching, and thus he speaks of it in a negative sense. What does he say? We never came with flattering speech. And I'll just say this as an aside, because these thoughts are always rumbling in the back of my mind. Whenever you are teaching this passage, a passage of scripture, try to give a practical example that people can relate to. We never came with flattering speech. This is this type of prosperity preaching that we hear about today. Be all that you can be, preaching in such a way not to build you up in the Lord, but preaching in a way that does not offend you, preaching in a way that makes you feel good, preaching in a way that gives you the wrong objective. The objective of all of our preaching, your objective is to please Christ. The objective of the minister, the objective of the hearer is to know one day you will stand before the eyes of fire of Jesus, the Messiah, the eyes that will burn through all of the riffraff of the wood, hay, and stubble of your life, and look for the gold, silver, and precious stones in your life. You must be prepared to stand before him in judgment. So thus, Paul said, when we spoke to you, we did not speak words that would simply flatter you or make you feel good. Notice, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. For greed. I like that. We were not preaching for money. We were not trying to say things to get your money. We were not trying to say things so that you would simply give us your money. So, I used to hear people say, man, you mess up and preach a sermon like that, you can forget about the offering that day. It won't be a good offering that day. Then fine, don't let it be a good offering. But whatever you do, you preach for the right reason. Notice what he said, a pretext for greed. It was not trying to use words to manipulate you to get your money. And he says what? God is witness. Again, as God is a witness, he who knows the heart, he who knows the reason why you do what you do. And he says, God knows we preached for pure motives, for the right reason, nor did we seek again. Notice what we said earlier, glory from men, whether from you or from others. It was not about us putting on a show. It was not about us trying to be appreciated or looking to be someone big or looking to be someone who the audience would appreciate and talk about and go home and say, oh my God, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. Because the end of all things, when I say the end of all things, the objective, the reason why is Christ and Christ alone. Takes my mind back to Paul, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians. Paul said, when I came unto you, I didn't come to you with all of these big words, wisdom and Sophia, wisdom of speech and being so articulate in language. I didn't come to you in that. I came to you in such rudeness of speech, such simplicity that I only wanted to speak about, to hear about Jesus Christ and him crucified. My message was simple. What Paul said Jesus was crucified and he rose from the dead. Paul, can you talk about anything? He said, well, that's the only thing that really means something to me. Paul, why are you speaking this way? Because this is the most important thing. Yes, Paul continues to say, even though I might be rude in speech, notice what I just said to you, Christ and crucified only, but I'm not rude in knowledge. Paul is still wise. He is very articulate. What did Festus say about Paul in the book of Acts? Paul, much learning has driven you mad. But anyway, I'm going on. The point that Paul is saying is they were not seeking glory from men. The glory always goes to God, as Paul says, even again, let's reference 1 Corinthians. He who glories, let him do what? Glory in the Lord. But anyway, so it goes on to the final point, verse number 6. Even though as apostles of Christ, we might have asserted our authority. Now, I hate this translation. I really hate this translation. It is dynamic equivalence at its best. Okay, okay. We don't want to use things that confuse you. Dynamic equivalence is when the translators of a biblical text, instead of giving you the literal Greek words of the text, and no translation gives you word for word Greek, none of them do, okay? But they try to hold closely to that, especially NASB, which is the reason why NASB is often called a wooden text or a difficult text, because it holds much closer to the Greek than any other modern Greek, modern English translation that I'm familiar with. But anyway, so this is basically dynamic equivalence to the uttermost when it says, though as apostle, we might have asserted our authority. So let us go to the Greek and let us try to examine the Greek and try to understand what the apostle Paul is talking about. So he says in verse number 7, do not menoi in bare. That is, having ability, that is the ability having in bare enai, to be burdensome. That's the idea. To be a burden, in a burden, to be. Hos Christou apostoloi, as of Christ's apostles, as the apostles of Christ. So he says, he literally says, ability to be a burden as Christ's apostles. So now let's go back and look what he just said. He says, we do not seek glory from men or from others. So as to say what? Even though we are the apostles of Christ and could have been such a burden, or even this burden of us in a sense. They could have been, in other words, who are you, Paul? I am Paul. We, and Paul and those who were following him, we are the apostles of Christ. And remember, these are men of the highest order. When you want to consider it, because there are no more apostles. In order to be an apostle, you have to have seen the resurrected Jesus. Jesus in bodily form resurrected from the dead. You would have to have had an appearance of Christ as well as the call from Christ with the apostolic gift, okay? And such men are no longer present. They are men of the highest order in the church. These are the apostles. So thus, if anyone could have glory, or if anyone could have an exalted position, it would be the apostles. And that's the point that Paul is trying to make. When I came to you, Thessalonians, I did not come in this exalted manner. Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ. No, but he came lowly because he was not seeking personal glory from them or from anybody. He was only seeking to do the job that Jesus sent him to do. And what Paul is also inferring here is the example that he himself has set. But anyway, this also speaks this point about not being a burden. He's going to, from this particular point, principal point, he's going to derive other statements. That is how Paul himself, and we're not going to get into it in this particular video, it'll be in the next one, but how Paul himself became an example to the Thessalonians about what? Working hard and laboring with his own hands to be an example to the Thessalonians that they too should do what? As they wait for the coming of Jesus Christ, to continue in this life to work hard with their own hands and labor. Even though Paul, as an apostle, could have been exempt from this. That's the key. Paul, as an apostle, could have been what? Exempt from these things. But nevertheless, he was an example. But let's continue on. But instead of coming to them with this particular air, now let's look at that dynamic equivalence, this air of authority. 7, we prove to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Let's finish it. Having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become very dear to us. So what does he say? Verse number 7, instead of coming to the Thessalonians with, I almost want to say a chip on the shoulder, but an air of authority, and it is an arrogant air of authority that Paul is insinuating here. Coming to them and being burdensome to them, or coming to them, bring it all together with flattering speech, or trying to manipulate them with words to get their money, or pretext for greed, seeking glory from men, trying to be all of that in front of them. No, Paul came to them seeking what was beneficial to them. Notice, instead of all of that, he proved to be gentle. And you can see Paul talking about what? His caring nature for the Thessalonians. And as he looks to them as babies, and he styles himself as a mother, and they are his babies. And how does a mother deal with a child? She nourishes, she protects and guards her precious child. The child is so precious to them. And thus he says what? As the mother, as the nurse tenderly cares for her own children. And thus Paul says what about the Thessalonians? And he has this great compassion for them. And because he loved them so dearly, he was willing to even impart of his own soul, suke, of his own self, of his own life, to give himself to them so completely. Why? Because they had become so dear to him. Okay, we'll stop right there. What we see in verses number 8, again, 1 through 8, Paul setting himself forth as an example to the Thessalonians. Number 1, remember the difficulties that we experienced in coming to you. the difficulties in Philippi, even the difficulties that we had in Thessalonica. But nevertheless, through all of these hardships, God proved himself. You are the proof that our gospel was not in vain. You heard and you received the gospel. But when we came to you, remember our example. Remember how we came. Number one, we knew what we were talking about. We were not men in error, or we did not do things to deceive men, or we didn't do things simply to get people's money. We did it for the right reasons. Our hearts and our motives were pure. And we looked after you. We didn't come to you with arrogance. We didn't come to you and burden ourselves upon you as the apostles of Christ, which we could have, but instead we were like a mother, and you were like our children, and we proved to be so tender and caring for you because you became dear to us. And in this environment, we preached the gospel and we nourished you in the gospel while we were there. And this, shall I dare say, is the portrait of a minister. Number one, don't be in error. Search the scriptures. Learn, understand the scriptures. Number two, search your own heart. Why are you doing what you're doing? Are you trying to put on a show? Trying to look cute in front of the audience, dressing sometimes inappropriately, looking like the world in too many cases, bringing all of the worldly foolishness in the church? And why are you doing all of these things? For money, to gain the crowd, to gain the appreciation, to gain the glory from men. Let God search your heart. But why are you doing these things? Because these people are dear to you, and you want God to approve your heart and to approve and entrust you with the gospel, just like he did Paul. All right, enough, guys. We thank the Lord for that teaching section today. And if this video has been a blessing to you and God touches your heart to support the ministry, there is always links in the description that you can use to support the ministry. And also, if you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe. All right, guys, see you next time.